Hey guys, Connor. You're watching the JavaScript Mastery series. In this video, we are going to be covering arrays from top to bottom, inside out. We are going to cover everything about arrays, but don't worry, it doesn't get too complicated. Arrays are pretty basic and they're not too hard to master. It's just a few tricky corners that you should be aware of. This video is going to be pretty straightforward, pretty easy. So we're going to rank it a blue belt, and everything that we cover in this video you should know at that graduate junior level. So first thing we're going to cover is, what are arrays and why do we actually use them. Then we will look at how do we create arrays and all of the different ways that we can create arrays, which way should we use and why. We'll then look at the elements of an array, how we can add and remove elements from that list. Then moving on, we will look at iterating over array. How do we loop through all the values? What are all the different arrays and which way should we use? And then we will look at the array API. And then finally, we will wrap up by just peeking under the hood a little bit and understanding how arrays in JavaScript are actually just objects. Wait, what? Yeah, arrays are just objects, but specialized kind of objects, and we should still use them because they still have a specific use case. So let's get started. So an array is a core data structure, not just in JavaScript, but in programming in general across all programming language. And all an array is an ordered collection of items. The correct technical term is elements. So just a ordered list of elements. Now this ordered list of elements starts from 0. So if we want to access the first element in a list, we use 0. If we want to access the second element, we use 1. And if we want to access third, 2, and so on, so on, so on. Given JavaScript's dynamic nature and its flexibility and its ability to just let you do whatever you want because it has no rules and it's wild, JavaScripts are very flexible. You see, in other programming languages, you may be forced to predefine an array and the size of that array in advance, so the memory can be pre-allocated for it, but not in JavaScript. JavaScript doesn't care. You can create an empty array with no elements, and you can add elements in later or remove them, and JavaScript will allocate the memory on the fly. So yeah, it's flexible in its size, letting you grow it and shrinking it as you please, but it's also flexibility in the types that you can use in that list. You see, you don't have to specify this is going to be a list of strings, a list of numbers, a list of objects. You can just create a list and put whatever you want in there. JavaScript doesn't care. It's wild. Now this flexibility can be quite powerful, right? We can do what we want, how we want to do it, and it gives us more control. And even though there is some maybe performance concerns, as other languages, they pre-allocate that memory, but with JavaScript, being able to pre-allocate it on the fly, with modern JavaScript engines such as V8, it can do this so effectively that there really isn't any concerns or any gains to be made by predefining that array. So arrays are super dynamic and flexible, and the performance concerns are that, hey, we're not pre-allocating the memory. How is this going to impact performance if the memory has to be pre-allocated on the fly? And the answer is it's still pretty performant. There's no concerns with modern JavaScript engines. It's able to do this so effectively and quickly that there really isn't any bottlenecks to not pre-allocating those memories. So we really just get to enjoy that flexibility without having to worry about that performance. Now, if you are super concerned about performance because you're building some kind of high frequency trading bot, then yeah, sure. But even then, we can still pre-allocate memory to an array in JavaScript if we want to. Also, we can be more strict with the types in an array in JavaScript as well with the use of typed arrays. These aren't very common and they're not used very often. I mean, if you do care about type safety in general, you probably just be using TypeScript anyway. So by far the most common and easiest way to create an array in JavaScript is by using bracket notation, as you can see here. So in this example, we are creating an array that contains a list of strings, and we could have just made this empty if we wanted to add elements in later. Now below is another example of just adding in numbers, but as is mentioned, we can just put anything in this list that we choose. Maybe even put an object in there. Maybe I'll even put, another array. You get the picture. Now, another way that we can create an array is by using invocation, which JavaScript allows us to do for all of its types. Arrays, no different. When we pass in no parameters, we're creating an empty array. If you pass in a single parameter that's a number, we are creating an array with predefined memory allocation. And if you pass in more value, then you actually are passing in the values that you actually want. So super strange, but let's just log this out quickly so I can see you guys what this looks like. So yeah, when you pass in a single value, we are creating 3 empty items, but that's only when we pass in a number, right? I mean, if you pass in a string, then it treats it as normal. So what if you wanted to just pass in a single value that was a number, the same way we passed in a single value that's hello for this constructor method? Not that you'd use this anyway, we would just use this, but if you had to use this, then we would have to use array of. So with this array of method, we can indeed just pass in a single value that's a number and create a list of items that is just one element which contains just that number. So when we log array 5, we should just get an element with just the one number, which would have been nice if we could do that in this example. Now another way that we can create a array is using array from. Now this is quite handy when we want to create an array from an type that is iterable in JavaScript. So for example, a string is iterable. So we can actually take a string value. Here we're taking the first element from this array, which is Super Mario Bros, and we can actually convert this into an array. What have I done? There we go. And just ignore that one second. And as you can see, we've taken that string and broken it out into an array of characters. So anything that's iterable, we can use the array from to convert it into an array. And then we can also pass in a callback function into that array from method if we want to manipulate the values in any way. So here we've taken the values from player scores, 100, 200, 300, 400, 500. And then we've manipulated those values by timesing it by 2. Then let's take a look at double scores. And as you can see, we've taken those values and we've manipulated them. Now, the fourth way we could create an array, and the way we may want to use is if we are copying the values from one list to another. So let's say we have player scores and I want another value that contains player scores. Maybe I want all of those scores and then I want to add some. Well, the easiest way to copy those values is to use a spread operator to spread those values into this array. Now, if this was a string or this was just any immutable value, we could have just said, hey, well, we want this value to equal this value. Now, as arrays are objects, all objects in JavaScript are reference types. So here we are just assigning player scores copy to the reference of player scores. Now, if this is a foreign concept to you, I recommend going back and checking out the earlier video that I did, primitives versus reference types, and we also cover this in objects basics as well. So instead of copying the reference, we want to copy the values. We can just spread those values in so that any changes made to the target value, in this case player scores copy, If I make any changes to this now, it won't make any changes to player scores. And if I make any changes to player scores, it won't impact player scores copy. Now, of course, guys, if you want your blue belt in JavaScript, then you're going to need to know how to manipulate an array. Pretty straightforward, right? We can add elements to the end of an array. We can use in the push method. We can add to the beginning of the array using onShift. We can remove values from the end of the array using pop, as well as removing them from the beginning with shift. So let's just take a look at what this list of scores looks like each time we use one of these methods to manipulate the array. So here we've got scores. Then we'll take a look at what scores after push. There we go. AI knows exactly what I want to do. It's just so as you can see, we got scores, and then after we push that 600 value, we can see 600 being added to the end of the list. After onShift, where we add an element to the beginning of an array, we can now see that it has a 0 at the beginning, and using the pop, we can see we was able to remove the last element of the array, which is 600. So they are 4 must-know methods to manipulate an array. So make sure you got them jotted down and you know them, and at some point you get the opportunity to practice them. Now we can also delete values from an array. However, when we do this, it leaves a hole in the array and makes the array what we call sparse. So let me demonstrate what I mean by that and what happens when we delete a value. So we're gonna log scores, and then I'm going to show you what happens after we delete a value. And as you can see, that value's been removed, but it hasn't set the value to null or undefined, or it hasn't just taken it hasn't changed, it hasn't popped the value out of the list. Instead, what it's done is it's left a hole in our array, a big gaping hole. And this is undesirable, as we've technically removed the value, but it's still something there that's empty. And also it's going to impact the length property, right? We should expect 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But when we delete values from an array, it doesn't update that length, and it gives a length that doesn't represent the true length of the array. So let me just see so when we look at the length of this value, and as you can see, even though we remove that value, the score length is still 5. Now, not only can we remove values from the beginning and end of the array, as well as being able to add them, but we can also remove values and add values from the middle of the array, as well as being able to just actually replace items. Now, to do this, we're going to use splice. So in this example, we have splice, not to be confused with slice. So let's console.log out the deck, and let's look at deck after splice. So ace 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, replace with 8, 2, 3, 6, 7, 8. Now what's happened here is at the position 4, we've removed one item, which is 0, 1, 2, 3. So at position 1, 2, 3, 4, we've removed the item 4. Now if we was to do 2 instead, it will remove 2 values. So ace 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 is gone, 7, 8, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, which will take out 5 and 6. Same thing, you guys can probably guess it by now. If I replace this with a 3, these 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 and 7 are gone. So that's how we can manipulate that array if we want to take out values somewhere in between, and if we wanted to actually replace those values with new one. So maybe we just open spade, joker. Now, this time, not only have we replaced the value of 5, but now we've actually gone and injected and replaced it with 2 new values, spade, that should be spade, and joker. As you can see, we've replaced those values. Now, because this alters the original value, we can actually, by assigning a variable to what's returned, we can access the elements that were deleted, which were 5. And again, guys, if I increase this value to 3 and we remove 3 values, we should get back 3 values that have all been removed. And let's bring this to 0, and there we go. So moving on to slice. Now slice, unlike splice, does not alter the original value. So if it doesn't alter the original value, what's its purpose? And its only purpose is to be able to pluck values out of that original array that you want without actually changing it. So in this case, we don't ever want to change deck, but maybe we want to get some values out of it. So let's see what happens if I was to just put in 0 and 0 in there. Sliced deck. It didn't return anything. Now let's see what happens when I put in 1. So here's our deck, and what it's done is it's sliced out. Best way to think about it is, imagine taking a slice of something, right? You are taking a slice out of the cake, and in here you're taking it between 0 and 1, which is spade. I always confuse splice and slice. I always end up using one or the other to realize that I've used the wrong one, then go back to using the other method. But an easy way to remember it is, if I want to take a value from that array, then I want to take a slice of it. So now we've got spade. Now if I change this to 2, I'm expecting it to take spade and joker. Spade and joker. If I do the same thing with 3, I'm expecting spade, joker and 4. And of course, if I was to increase this value to do it from index 3, I'm expecting joker and 4. There we go. There is another way that we can manipulate an array if we want to truncate it, but feels a bit hacky, feels a bit wrong. Not many people know it, and you should definitely use it sparingly. But another way of manipulating an array is by manipulating the length. So let's just look at that deck. Now, before we do this, actually, let's look at the length of that deck. Now, let's just look at the deck. I've already got it there. Clear. So here's our deck. Now, if I was to change the length to say 5, watch what happens. 1, 2, 3. And then deck after length cut. As you can see, there's been some values removed. So we've removed 7 and 8, and that's because we assigned the length to 5. So 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then you've got 7 and 8 that's been removed. And of course, if you reset it all the way to 0, then we are going to completely truncate that array and remove all of its values. So just a quick recap: adding elements, beginning and end of the array, as well as removing them. You want to familiarize yourself and make sure you know all 4 of those methods. If you need to, you can delete elements of an array, but they leave them empty and make the array sparse. So be cautious using the delete. Now, if you want to manipulate that original array, or possibly even get the values returned, and you need a bit more flexibility and control. For example, you want to remove an element from the middle of the array and add some new elements. You want to use splice. If you don't want to impact the original array, but you want to pluck out some values, then you want to use slice. And of course, you can do it, but it doesn't mean you should. You can truncate an array just by manipulating the length property. If you want to remove some values from the end, or set it to 0 just to completely wipe out the list altogether. Iterating arrays in JavaScript is super easy. In fact, all arrays come with this available for each method for doing just that. And this is going to allow us to iterate through every element in that list. And in this example, we're just logging that value. And if you expose the second parameter, you can access the index as well if you want that. So if I do node iterating, as we can see, we're able to access all of those values. Now, if you want to maybe exit that loop early and you don't want to go all the way to the end and you need a bit more control, you can use the for of method, which is available for all iterable objects in JavaScript. So not just arrays, you could technically do this on a string as well. So in this example, we're going to continue if cars equal 5. You could technically do that in the for each with a return, but we can also break early as well. So if card is equal to 6, we could break out. And now you know, let's keep that one there so we can see the difference. And there we skip the 5. Let's use another value, and then we'll break, say, when we get to 7. If the value is 7, so we never get that far. As you can see, we are able to end that loop early. Now you can of course just use an old-fashioned boomer loop, old school, but don't hate on it, guys. It is as clunky as it looks. It has some uses. So we initialize the iterator. We set the condition when we want it to stop, and we decrement it. So this can be useful if you need a bit more control over the iteration. Like maybe instead of going up by 1, I equals that. Let's just revert. Let's make this. So let's start this from 0, and let's say I less than dec dot length, and then let's plus it. So here we are, we're looping through it, but maybe we want a bit more control. Maybe you want to just iterate it in 2 steps instead of 1 to make a bigger jump. Maybe you want to do 5. There we go, we got a bit more control. Or maybe you want to go in reverse. So I equals, should be something like dec is the length of dec, and then I has got to be, what would it be, something like greater than equal to 0, I think. And then we will decrement through it instead. Now let's see what that looks like. And kaboom, we've gone through it in reverse, and we can go in reverse in multiple steps. So yeah, just a handy tool if you need a bit more control if the iteration. Now, why would you want to do that in production? You wouldn't. Typically, it comes up in those coding interviews, doesn't it? Those whiteboard challenges. Do something crazy like loop through the loop, but do it every 5 iterations instead of 1 for absolutely no reason. Then the point of this interview. So in JavaScript, when we work with arrays, we gain access to JavaScript's rich API. This makes handling data super efficient when whether we're finding, we're transforming, manipulating, or sorting data. Whatever we need to do with our list of elements, the reality is that this has probably already been covered, and there's going to be a built-in method for it, right? So maybe if we want to check if a value exists in a list, rather than looping through that loop every single time and then seeing if a value equals Minecraft, we can just utilize this pre-built includes method. If you want the index of an element, we could use, there's a method for that. We can even join an array into a string if we wanted to. We can check if, say, every element in a list meets a particular condition and return true if it does. So does every game have a length over 3? We can check if only some games include Mario, so on and so forth. We can manipulate the values to make them all. We can use map to transform an list of elements into a separate list. So here we are using 2 methods actually. We are using a map to transform all those values, and then we are converting them all into uppercase. We can sort values, we can put them in reverse. There's so much we can do. Now the point of this video, or this segment in particular, is not to try and memorize every single method that's available for arrays in JavaScript. We're not going to do that, and that's not the point of the video. The point is to be aware that when we are using arrays, there's lots of powerful pre-built methods that we can utilize. We just need to know that they exist, and we need to know to look for them. The last thing you want to do is be in a coding interview and then start writing a for loop to check if this value in Minecraft exists, right? You want to be able to just boom, includes. So whenever we're doing something with arrays, we just need to know where to look. I'll drop the link in the description, and we want to know where to look, and we want to familiarize ourselves just a little bit with all of the methods that are available. No one's expecting you to memorize them, of course, that would be crazy. But just know that when these common problems go up, instead of your first thought being, okay, let me loop through this and let me start comparing this value and seeing if I can do that, just say, hey, let me see what's available in the array API and see if there's an existing method that I can utilize for my problem. And over time, this will become second nature. You'll start to form those mental hooks, and you'll just start to remember them naturally, right? Especially with names like filter. Next time you have a list of elements and you want to filter out some values, you'll just remember, oh yeah, there's a filter. If I want to check if every element in the array meets a condition, I remember I've used that before. Oh, I need to find, there we go. So at this level, we just want to be aware of the array API, know to look for it, and make as much use of it as possible. Okay, so the last part, the more techie part, and the part that's going to set you apart from the other developers at this level, because not many people actually know this about arrays in JavaScript. But arrays are just objects. Arrays are objects. If you was to use the type of operator on an array, it would return objects. It wouldn't return an array. Now, when we look at the elements of an array, when we access them, right, 0, 1, 2, 3, they actually look like the brackets that we might use on an object when we're accessing properties dynamically, and they actually work in a very similar way. You see, those elements, those indexes are actually just stringified keys, and if you actually rewrite the object like this, it actually begins to look a bit like an array. Now you might start to think, well, what's the point of even using an array then? Why don't I just create a gigantic object and start listing all of the elements with numbers? Well, you still want to use an array because those numeric values still come with some performance benefits. Arrays are optimized by the JavaScript engine for those numeric index access. So you're still going to want to use an array, even though you can technically use an object with the keys. And arrays automatically use the length property to track how much elements exist in that list. And as we just saw in the previous segment, when we use arrays, we get access to that rich API that comes with a lot of powerful tools that we can utilize. And also, using arrays make it obvious what type of data we're dealing with to other engineers that are reading the code. If I have a list of something, but then I start to put it in an object and then use numbers as keys to access those properties, people are going to get super confused. So don't do that. We still want to use arrays, even though they are objects. They are specialized objects that still work great for the task at hand. So when we have a list, we definitely still want to use arrays. Just know arrays are objects. And if you want to know if a value is an array, we cannot use the type of operator, but there's actually a special method called array.isArray, which we can use to see if something is actually an array or not. Try to remember that, because that's one thing that can trick people in a job interview, right? Someone asks you, hey, how do I get the type of an array? And then you think, oh, I'll just use the type of operator. Well, no, you can't, because arrays will return objects. So you need to use the specialized isArray method to see if that value is indeed an array. So guys, that brings us to the end of the video. Hopefully now you understand exactly what arrays are and why we use them and their purpose. Hopefully you understand all those different ways to create arrays. Don't worry if you're a bit overwhelmed, because there was lots of different methods. Really, you only need to know the one method. You're only going to be using the one method. In fact, I may have only used one or two of those methods to create an array in specialized scenarios. Now, we moved on to how we can manipulate an array, adding and deleting elements. Understanding all of those different methods, especially the beginning and end of an array, is a must. Then we covered splice and slice for more control over how we manipulate arrays. We covered iterating arrays, pretty straightforward. Then we explored how we should be aware of Arrays rich API and how we should utilize that to save time and be more efficient. Then finally, we looked at how arrays are just specialized kinds of objects, but they're still optimized for lists of ordered data, and we should still use them because they come with many benefits. So hope you got some value from this video. If you liked it, please actually like it. It helps the algorithm. And if you want to stay tuned for the next video, where we will be covering the final video on the Blue Belt series, functions, then make sure you're subscribed so you get notified when that gets released. And I will see you in the next one.